Hello and welcome back to the Mitigation Hierarchy Training Program, focusing on the application of the mitigation hierarchy in EIA. So now we've come to the fifth and final session in the training module, and this session will focus on how to incorporate the mitigation hierarchy into EIA reports, focusing on the EIRs and the EMPRs and the conditions of authorization issued by the competent authorities. Before we proceed with this final session, I just want to briefly revisit the key NEMA principles relevant to the mitigation hierarchy that I referred to back in session 1. According to these principles, application of avoidance, minimization, and remedy must be applied in a wide range of circumstances, including when there is disturbance of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, and then also any negative environmental impact or impacts on people's environmental rights. And bearing in mind that the environmental right refers both to a healthy environment and one that is conducive to well-being. In this regard, we are still learning a great deal about ecosystem dynamics and interdependencies, and how these translate into benefits for people. Significantly, the NEMA principles applying as they do to the actions of all organs of state that may affect the environment makes it essential that the mitigation hierarchy be applied in all EIA reports as well as to the conditions of authorization. So in this session, we'll begin with a review of respective responsibilities for key role players in the EIA process. I will then look at what is and isn't acceptable in terms of trade-offs, and I'll explain what trade-offs mean a bit later. And then the third part of the session will focus on how mitigation measures ought to be framed in the EIA report, the EMPR, and the conditions of authorization. Beginning with the responsibilities of the specialist, the minimum requirements are listed on the slide. Firstly, and most obviously, the specialist must have knowledge of and adhere to all relevant guidelines, laws, and conservation planning instruments. So for ecologists and biodiversity specialists, these would include, among other things, the biodiversity conservation plans, the CBA maps, and species-specific environmental management plans, those drafted in terms of the NEM Biodiversity Act. Importantly, specialists must understand the application and implementation of the screening tool, including the various gazetted protocols for specialist assessments on specific environmental themes, such as the animal and plant species theme, as well as the terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity themes. A second requirement relevant to all specialists is a clear explanation of the criteria being used to assess significance, as was discussed in session 2 of the training, and then also to advise on the consideration of low-impact alternatives, including spatial, temporal, and design alternatives. Fourth, it is up to the specialist to identify fatal flaws and where there will be a loss of irreplaceable resources, and then to make their recommendations accordingly. The specialist report should demonstrate explicit application of the mitigation steps and how these have been considered proportionally to the significance of impacts and risks, with the emphasis on avoidance and minimization. Proposed mitigation measures must be outcomes-based. They must reflect a revision of what the desired result of the project should be, and where relevant, this should be aligned with policy goals or strategic directions for an area, and these may be conveyed in planning instruments such as EMFs or SDFs. The precautionary principle must be applied to all steps in the process, including baseline data gathering, impact assessment, and potential effectiveness of mitigation measures. Finally, there must be a clear statement of assumptions and limitations, uncertainties, as well as knowledge gaps, and then the specialist must also explain the implications of these for the assessment. Moving on to the responsibilities of the EAPS. As professional practitioners, EAPS need to keep up with relevant legislative developments and have a sound knowledge of protocols and guidelines associated with the various acts and regulations. One of the most important of these is, of course, the screening tool. Drawing from the results of the screening tool application, the EAP is responsible for drafting the terms of reference for specialist studies, and these should at minimum require demonstrable application of the mitigation hierarchy steps. The specialist must be required to identify avoidance strategies, or at least lower impact alternatives, and then also consider the range of impacts, including direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. The EAP also needs to be proactive in communicating any fatal flaws to the project proponent, those that may be identified by either one or more specialists. And then the EAP must spell out those implications to the developer for the viability of the project proposal. The EIA should match guidance around mitigation and the goals thereof to the steps in the mitigation hierarchy, so that it is clear how the mitigation hierarchy has been applied throughout the process, and any recommendation for an offset must be well grounded in the identification and assessment of residual impacts. Specialist work must be properly reviewed, and there must be an indication of the level of uncertainty attached to findings and recommendations, particularly in relation to the likely success of minimisation and remediation measures. It goes without saying that the recommendations by the specialists must be faithfully and fully reflected in the EIA report. And then finally, any trade-offs must be fully justified and guided by the trade-off rules, which I will explain just now. Finally, the decision maker. So most importantly, decision-making must be guided by the NEMA principles, which we have referred to previously, as well as the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. It is up to the competent authority to ensure that, firstly, the mitigation hierarchy has been applied with an emphasis on preventing negative impacts, and that all reasonable and feasible alternatives have been considered. It must be checked that there are no fatal flaws, and that any potentially fatal flaw has not been possibly overlooked or presented as less significant than it should be. The competent authority needs to check that the levels of uncertainty have been taken into account and that the precautionary principle has been applied. It is also very important that a valid and consistent approach to assessing significance is reflected in the report as a basis for mitigation. The merits of any trade-offs must be properly considered, such that these do not compromise environmental rights and ecological sustainability. And the decision maker needs to ensure that the mitigation measures proposed are outcomes-based, and that they are also measurable and auditable and suitable for inclusion in the conditions of authorization. Finally, the decision maker may also need to exercise their discretion at times in specifying the need for the application of the mitigation hierarchy if this has not been adequately addressed in the EIA report. So I've used this term trade-offs quite frequently, and trade-offs are a persistent challenge for EAPs, a challenge that stems in part from the wording in the Constitution, which refers to ecologically sustainable and justifiable economic and social development. There tends to be, consequently, a weighing up of social and economic benefits against biodiversity loss. And the problem here is that it tends to overlook those social and economic values that are inherent within biodiversity and ecological processes. So on this slide is a reminder of what trade-off means. It's also defined in the mitigation hierarchy guideline. So trade-offs occur when two or more conflicting objectives exist in a situation where natural resources are limited. The result is a negative outcome for one attribute being exchanged for a positive outcome for the other, such as loss of indigenous plants in favour of commercial agriculture. In the draft mitigation hierarchy guideline, there is a dedicated section on trade-offs, including some specific trade-off rules or guidelines, some of which are listed on the slide. So firstly, one has to be wary of presuming that project development is always more desirable for communities than biodiversity conservation, as we've seen in a number of situations, particularly in relation to communities affected by negative impacts of mining and oil and gas exploration. People attach considerable value to biophysical and heritage resources as a source of livelihoods and spiritual well-being. Secondly, enhancement in one area cannot compensate for incomplete mitigation of significant impacts in another, where stronger mitigation measures ought to be implemented. For example, the declaration of a Ramsar wetland in one locality shouldn't be viewed as compensating for degradation of another site in the same vicinity, given that the overall trajectory remains one of declining biodiversity across the country. And then third, when considering trade-offs, it is essential to avoid aggravating or worsening the vulnerability of people by damaging or destroying ecosystem services, particularly in the face of climate change. Fourth, residual impacts which cannot be compensated or offset can only be allowed in highly exceptional circumstances where there is overriding public interest, with due consideration given to South Africa's international obligations. And then fifth, development in a CBA 1, that's a critical biodiversity area 1, with irreplaceable biodiversity should not be permitted, even when compensation is proposed. As the term irreplaceable indicates, the biodiversity cannot be replicated. Also bearing in mind that biodiversity offsets are the most risky mitigation measure and should not distract from the imperative to conserve biodiversity through avoidance. 6. Trade-off in areas of existing concern which result in further decline should not be considered, as then you're simply shifting the consequences of decline onto the next generation, which is at odds with the constitutional right and the NEMA principles. And then finally, as indicated in the previous session, trade-offs involving substitutions in kind do not count as mitigation, but must rather be in addition to avoiding ecological loss. So in other words, one mustn't mix up mitigation requirements with a developer's ESG obligations. That's their environmental and social governance responsibilities, what used to be called corporate social responsibility. And this distinction has been confirmed in a couple of court judgments, which I've quoted from. So these two matters refer to instances where the conditions of approval for the respective EIAs have been declared unlawful. In the SLC case, the judge highlights that the promise to provide services for community housing is not a condition that pertains to the impact of the identified activities. In other words, it's not a valid mitigation measure. And in the second example, the Hungklip case, the judge points out that a condition requiring a developer to make a contribution to social housing is invalid simply because it does not relate to the impact of the authorized activity. Despite these judicial precedents, I'm pretty sure that most EAPs have dealt with instances where developers trust that socio-economic benefits can be traded off against environmental damage. And this is not to say that contributions to uplift communities shouldn't be encouraged, but they can't be implemented in lieu of the developer taking responsibility for negative impacts on the environment and for damage to biodiversity. So in these last few slides, I'll consider how mitigation measures ought to be framed in these three key reports or documents that are integral to the EIA process. So this is a very high-level indication of just some of the key advisories when it comes to how mitigation measures are stipulated. And what I've stressed here is the need for outcomes-based mitigation measures across all types of reports. So in other words, the mitigation measures must reflect the envisaged results of the intervention. The framing of mitigation measures, or how they are described, should be coherent and consistent, but not necessarily identical in the EIA report, the EMPR, and the conditions of authorization. And this is because each type of document has an overlapping but distinct purpose, and the primary readership or intended audience is also distinct. So just to run through some of the distinguishing features in respect of mitigation. Firstly, your EIA report. This needs to emphasize the desired outcomes or objectives and must be logically and clearly linked to the anticipated aspects and impacts which are identified during the scoping and EIA phase. The EMPR needs to include more detail because here your primary concern is to do with effective implementation of the mitigation measure. So the way the mitigation measures are spelled out needs to be readily transferable into contract documents for the construction and operational phase. I've also highlighted the need for consistency with the EIA report. And what this means is that the EMPR should not refer to impacts that were not identified and assessed in the EIA. And if such impacts are only realized when it comes to the drafting of the EMPR, then the assessment phase needs to be revisited. And then importantly, we do not refer to the EMPR as a static document, but rather a living document, which should be adjusted and updated, but it is also a control document with version numbers so that changes can be tracked and monitored. Finally, with the conditions of approval, the emphasis shifts to accountability. The decision-making authority must be concerned with both outcomes and compliance. It must also be borne in mind that the decision-maker, although will draw on the content of the EIA report and the EMPR, also retain some discretion, so the authorities are entitled to specify stricter measures or hold the developer to a higher standard of performance, provided these requirements are rational and reasonable as required in terms of the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. I will now quickly run through some examples of mitigation measures in these three different report contexts. So in this slide, I've provided a couple of examples of how one might frame mitigation measures in the EIR. Here it is useful to refer back to the aspects that one would have identified in the EIA and then express the desired outcomes. So I'll just go through the first example quickly. So here we see with reference to groundwater. In this instance, the objective is to maintain groundwater quality according to a baseline, or otherwise it could also be a prescribed water quality standard. And then in the second column, the type of mitigation measures are detailed, but without going into the same level of prescription or method statement that one might find in the EMPR. And then in the third column, that reference or cross-reference to the EMPR is provided so that one can look up the detail of how to implement the type of mitigation. Moving on to the EMPR, I've already highlighted some of the key requirements previously, so I'll not go through this in any detail. Suffice to draw attention to the key aspects. So the need to retain outcomes, to include the required actions to meet targets or objectives, to allocate roles and responsibilities, specify indicators, include requirements for monitoring and reporting on effectiveness, to make provision for internal and independent auditing, and finally to ensure that sufficient financial allocation is given over to mitigation, and preferably a contingency to cater to any emergency or unexpected situations. So it's important to bear in mind that the more concise and definitive the mitigation measures in the EMPR are, the more predictable the conditions of authorization are likely to be, because the authorities will have all the detailed information they need to fulfill their decision-making obligations and mandate. So here I have listed some examples of mitigation measures taken from an actual EMPR, which are either too vague, ambiguous, or indicate that inadequate attention has been paid to the assessment of impacts in the first place in the EIA, as indicated in these last two bullet points on the slide. And then for the remainder, I have highlighted problematic words or terms that are imprecise or ambiguous. So when writing mitigation measures, it is important that qualifiers or descriptors are not open to more than one interpretation. So for example, to manage alien infestation, this should be written far more precisely to ensure a minimum standard of effectiveness, and here I have provided an alternative which is far more exacting. Similarly, the requirement to keep the development footprint as small as possible leaves the door wide open for the developer to define what is possible or convenient for the project rather than what is a responsible environmental approach. So here again, I have provided an alternative text. Then thirdly, the requirement that no unnecessary crossings of watercourses should take place is again open to interpretation. It cannot be left to the developer to interpret what is necessary. So a far less ambiguous way of putting this requirement would be to prescribe no-go zones on a map or development plan, and then these can be demarcated on the site itself by the ECO. Finally, each of these mitigation measures should be matched to a specific outcome or objective so that the developer and their team of contractors, as well as the ECO, knows exactly what needs to be achieved. So moving on to how mitigation measures are described and included in the conditions of authorization. So as previously mentioned, the emphasis here needs to be on accountability and enforcement. The competent authority must make sure that decisions and recommendations are rooted in defensible reasons, including consideration of avoidance and low-impact alternatives. In addition to complying with the EIA regulations, the decision-maker, as previously mentioned, must be guided by the requirements of the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act and Section 2 of NEMA. Beyond that, I've already highlighted the need for a direct link between the impact and the conditions included in the authorization. Important also in terms of accountability is a procedure for authorization of changes, and this is to ensure that the developer can't decide to rewrite the EMPR post-authorization. As previously stressed, the EMPR must be a control document so that any changes or inclusion of adaptive measures can also be traced throughout the process. Other requirements include timeframes, consequences for non-compliance, auditing and inspections including the frequency thereof, and finally the inclusion of any relevant suspensive or resolutive conditions, which I'll explain just now. And these steps will all make the conditions of authorization more robust and also less vulnerable to legal challenges. So just to clarify the difference between the suspensive and resolutive conditions. A suspensive condition effectively suspends the authorization until certain requirements have been fulfilled that are considered key to the success of mitigation. And this can include the requirement for a developer to provide a financial guarantee. A resolutive condition allows for the lapse of the authorization if specified actions are not taken within a stipulated time frame. So the inclusion of such conditions is an example where the competent authority can use its discretion to ensure that the mitigation conditions will be met, subject to consequences for the project as a whole. This final example is a condition relevant to offsetting, and I've included it because it is illustrative of an outcomes-based condition and how this should be framed. So right at the outset, the vision or described end goal is established, and in this instance, the applicant is obliged to secure and do all that is necessary to facilitate the protection of biodiversity. And then additional precise and exacting detail is provided. So here there is very little wriggle room for the project proponent in terms of the expectations. Lastly, I must stress that mitigation measures are not only conveyed via the contents of EIA reports, the EMPR, and conditions of authorization. There are many other ways in which types of mitigation can and should be recorded and communicated, including in hard texts or through digital media and GIS maps and databases. And on this slide, I've just listed a few examples referring to the different steps in the mitigation hierarchy. So things like conceptual plans for avoidance and minimization, inclusion in layouts, designs, models, and then when it comes to minimization, rehabilitation, and restoration, in addition to the EMPR, there are many other ways to communicate techniques for minimization, rehabilitation and restoration on different types of management plans and through the use of different media. And then compensation and offsets. Here you can have specific management plans where relevant, such as the biodiversity offset agreements, livelihood restoration programs, resettlement action plans, etc. And just a final quote or words of advice to end off with, and this is included as one of II's fast tips for practitioner. The fact that EAPs and specialists should challenge a project. If there are better ways of doing it, press the proponent and the project team to be creative in developing alternatives. Decision-making occurs throughout the design of the project, not only at the end. And that does bring us to the end of this training module. I hope it's been informative, and I would really encourage you to spend time reading through the Mitigation Hierarchy Guideline and start applying the framework more creatively and explicitly to your projects. It remains for me to say a final thank you for listening, and please take note of where you can find the Draft Mitigation Hierarchy Guideline, as well as some additional references on the final slide.